Mick Jagger reaches an age he never thought he would see, and it feels almost strange to think of the man who once danced across stages like a whirlwind now being over 80. Yet his story at this stage of life is not what most people imagine, because the number itself tells only part of the truth, and the rest is wrapped in moments that are both beautiful and bittersweet. The kind of moments that make you stop and think about how time changes even the most unstoppable souls. And when you picture Mick in his younger days, with the lights blinding the crowd and the roar of thousands of voices chanting his name, it is hard to imagine that same man now counting the years with a quiet awareness that each one is more precious than the last. He has lived through decades of fame, scandal, love, heartbreak, and music that will never be forgotten. Yet crossing this milestone age carries a weight he never fully expected. It is not just about getting older, it is about watching the world shift around you while you remain a living piece of history, a survivor of an era that has lost many of its brightest lights. And for Mick, reaching this age is almost like standing on a mountaintop and seeing all the roads he has walked, some filled with glory and some lined with shadows he rarely speaks of. He has outlived so many who once stood beside him on stage and in life, and each birthday now seems less like a celebration and more like a moment to reflect on what is left and what has been lost. The energy that once kept him running through endless tours has slowed, not because his spirit has weakened, but because his body has started to speak a language he cannot ignore. A language of limits, aches, and reminders that time is undefeated. And while fans still see him as the unstoppable icon, Mick knows that every year that passes is another reminder that the spotlight does not last forever. Yet there is something deeply human in this stage of his life. Something raw and honest in the way he faces the mirror now, knowing that the young man in leather pants and wild hair is still inside him, but lives alongside the man who moves more slowly, speaks more softly, and thinks more deeply about how he spends the time he has left. There is no denying that reaching this age is a victory, but for someone who has always lived like there was no tomorrow, it also brings a quiet, almost haunting realization that tomorrow is no longer guaranteed, and it is in that mix of triumph and vulnerability where the true story of Mick Jagger at over 80 begins. A story that makes you wonder not just how he has lived this long, but how he chooses to live now, when every day feels like both a gift and a countdown. The world still remembers Mick Jagger as the Electric Rolling Stones frontman, the man whose energy seemed endless and whose presence could light up the biggest stadiums on Earth. Yet behind closed doors, his days now look very different. And that contrast is both surprising and quietly heartbreaking because the image people carry of him is frozen in time, full of sweat, fire, and the sound of guitars shaking the air. But that version of Mick is no longer the one who wakes up each morning. The truth is that life off the stage has a slower rhythm now, and it is one that few outside his circle ever get to see. It is not that he has lost the fire that made him an icon. It is that the fire burns differently, softer, more private, more aware of the years that have passed, and when the applause fades and the lights go out, he is left with a silence that feels heavier than it once did. In those moments, the reality sinks in that the world that adored him is still out there, but his role in it has changed. And that change is not easy for someone who spent most of his life being the heartbeat of a generation. There are still moments when the old Mick shows up, maybe when he plays a guitar riff alone in his home or listens to a song that brings back the rush of youth. But those moments are fleeting and often followed by long stretches of quiet, perhaps a walk in the garden or reading in the late afternoon light. Things that seem so ordinary for anyone else, but feel strangely out of place when you picture Mick Jagger doing them. It makes you wonder what thoughts pass through his mind when the phone doesn't ring as much, when tours are fewer, when people he once called friends are no longer here to share the memories. It is a life that still has comfort and even luxury, but it is also one that carries the weight of decades and the quiet truth that fame is only loud when the world is watching. And while fans might imagine him spending his days in wild parties and non-stop music, the reality is a far gentler, lonelier rhythm, one where the man who once seemed untouchable is now more human than ever. And that truth is something most will never see unless they look past the legend to the man himself. The man who still loves music, but also sits in silence long enough to feel the passage of time. The man who once ran toward the crowd but now often walks away from it. Not because he doesn't love it anymore, but because he knows the stage is no longer his whole life. And in that shift, there is a quiet mystery that leaves you wondering just how different Mick Jagger's life has become when no one is there to watch. Ozzy Osbourne's passing shook the music world in a way that felt almost unreal. But for Mick Jagger, it was something far deeper and far more personal. It was as if a piece of the world he had always known had suddenly vanished, leaving behind a space that could never be filled. And while the two men came from different bands and different sounds, they were brothers in the same world of rock, both carrying the scars, the wild stories, and the shared understanding of what it meant to live life in the fast lane for decades. Mick had seen friends and fellow legends pass before, but Ozzy's death struck a different chord. Perhaps because it reminded him of how fragile the thin line between survival and farewell had become at their age. The music industry lost a showman, but Mick lost a reminder of his own resilience. Someone who had walked through the same storms and somehow kept standing. And now that figure was gone, leaving Mick to look at his own reflection with a sharper awareness that his name could one day be spoken in the same breath. He did not speak much about it publicly, but those close to him say the news left him quieter for days, almost withdrawn, as if replaying memories and thinking about the wild, reckless years when the idea of slowing down never crossed their minds. It is a strange thing when you see the people you thought would always be around slowly disappear from the picture, not because of arguments or distance, but because time itself takes them away. And for Mick, Ozzy's death was like a shadow that followed him into every room. A reminder that the era they had both defined was ending piece by piece. It is not just the loss of a person, but the loss of a chapter in history. One that only a few still living can truly remember from the inside, and that realization can make even the loudest rooms feel empty. Fans might imagine that rock legends grow numb to loss after so many years in the spotlight, but the truth is that each one cuts a little deeper because it is not just a friend who is gone. It is another mirror, another life that could have been his. And when you are past 80, those reminders do not fade. They linger in the quiet hours when you least expect them, making you think about what you have done, what you have left to do, and how much time you really have to do it. And so Ozzy's death became more than a headline for Mick. It became a turning point, a silent jolt that made him realize that every moment left was not just precious, but urgent, because the curtain always falls sooner than you think. Friends say the man who once lit up stadiums now spends hours alone, avoiding the spotlight he once ruled, and that image is almost impossible to believe if you only remember Mick Jagger in his prime, dancing across the stage with wild energy and feeding off the roar of thousands of fans. Yet the people closest to him insist that this quieter, more withdrawn version is real and has been slowly taking over in recent years. It is not that he has lost his love for music or the thrill of performing, but something inside him has shifted, as if the weight of years, losses, and changes in the world have made the noise less exciting and the quiet more comforting. They say he spends long stretches of time in his home, sometimes just walking around in silence or sitting by a window with a faraway look in his eyes. Not because he is sad every moment, but because he has become someone who values being unseen after a lifetime of being watched. There is a strange contrast in imagining a man who once sought every camera, now turning away from them, who once lived for the stage, now choosing not to step on it unless absolutely necessary. And it makes you wonder what thoughts are heavy enough to keep a man like Mick Jagger in the shadows. Some believe it is the growing number of empty chairs at his table, the friends and fellow artists who are no longer here to share the moments. Others think it is simply the natural pull of age, the desire to protect what energy remains instead of spending it on constant public appearances. But there is also an air of mystery around his retreat, because Mick has never been someone to reveal his feelings easily. And so fans are left with only glimpses, a rare photo here, a short interview there, never enough to truly know what his life looks like when no one is watching. It creates a kind of suspense because the world knows he is still out there, still breathing, still thinking, but choosing to do it away from the flashing lights that defined him for so long. And it is in that choice that the most intriguing questions lie. What does a man who has seen and done everything think about when he is alone? What does he replay in his mind when the silence surrounds him? And perhaps the hardest question of all, does he miss the life he left behind? Or has he finally found a kind of peace that the stage could never give him? Whatever the answer, it seems clear that the Mick Jagger the world sees now is only a small part of who he has become, and the rest remains hidden in the quiet corners where he spends most of his days, leaving the rest of us to imagine the full story. His health, his habits, and his old rock star lifestyle have all changed in ways that will shock his lifelong fans, because the man who once lived on the edge, running on little sleep, wild nights, and endless tours, now moves through life with a kind of carefulness that feels almost unnatural for someone like Mick Jagger. It is not that he has become fragile in spirit, but his body has started to set rules he cannot ignore, and that has forced him to give up parts of himself that once felt essential. Gone are the nights of endless partying, replaced with early evenings and quiet routines. The heavy drinks and late mornings have turned into balanced meals and early walks, and the chaos that once fueled him has been traded for structure. Yet, even with these changes, there is still an air of mystery, because while he appears to be taking better care of himself than ever, those who know him say there are moments when he struggles with the reality that this is not a choice he made, but a choice time made for him. The shift from reckless freedom to cautious living can feel like losing a piece of your identity, and for Mick, who built his life on breaking rules, it is both strange and challenging to follow them. Fans would be stunned to see him in these quiet moments, maybe sipping tea instead of champagne, reading instead of running across a stage, or taking a long pause to catch his breath after climbing stairs. Small signs that the years have changed him. Yet there is also something deeply human about it, because even legends cannot outrun age forever. And in Mick's case, the adjustments tell a bigger story. A story about a man learning to live within new limits, without letting go of the fire that made him who he is. It is this balance that keeps people wondering, has Mick truly accepted this slower pace, or is there still a part of him fighting to break free, to feel that wild rush one more time? There is suspense in not knowing if these changes are permanent, or if one day he will surprise everyone with a burst of the old Jagger energy. Because even now, he carries that unpredictability that made him fascinating for decades. And while his health and habits may have transformed, the question that lingers is whether he sees these changes as a loss or as a survival. Perhaps it is both. And perhaps that is why he remains such a mystery, living between the man he was and the man he has become, trying to keep one foot in the past while the other is firmly planted in a present that demands more care than he ever imagined.